So we're going to practice some factoring. We'll do trinomials. Okay, several different types of trinomials we can work with. First one we'll take a look at would be this one. So you go ahead and try that. So when we factor this, there's mental math that we think about doing this with guess and check. I'll just write out what the mental thoughts are perhaps running through your head. This is the X. Some people like to call it the X box when you do a certain procedure, but we're just making the X for a little organization. We have the 6 that has to add to be -5. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to be 6 and add to be 5. Well, we've got some choices. We've got 6 and 1. And you also have a possibility of a 2 and a 3. If the 2 and 3 were both negative, that would add to be -5. That would multiply to be -6. But if you tried the 1 and the 6, to get to a -5, you would have to have a -6 and a 1 to get to -5. So yeah, the actual best option here is to have -3 and -2. So those are going to be your two values that are going to go into the parentheses, the two binomials. We have x and x, that would make x squared. You have -2 and -3, that when you FOIL that together, you make -5. And then they're both negative, which means when you multiply them, you get a +6. Good job. So there's one you can try. So two numbers that multiply to be -40 that add to be 3. We have 8 and 5 that multiplies to be 40. And for it to be a +3 when they add together, you've got to have a -5. So now you have two numbers that multiply to be -40 that add to be 3. We're going to put it into our parentheses with our x's, because when they multiply together, that makes x squared. When you do the outer and inner, they have to add up to be 3. So you have -5 and you have a +8. And then when you multiply the last two, that's what multiplies to be your 40. So that would be your factors of x squared plus 3x minus 40. Here's one for you. So when we look at this one, in the past, we've just been trying to figure out what is 40 that adds to be 3. We can't get 4 that adds to be 9. Because this has an a value that's bigger than 1, we cannot treat it the same way we did up here. This is much more difficult a problem. When the a value is greater than 1, it complicates things a little bit. So there's, of course, a guess and check, and we'll talk about that. But first, we're going to solve this one using what's called factor by grouping. And to do factor by grouping, we've got to figure out two numbers that are going to multiply to be our outside terms. Negative 36, that add to be our inside term. That adds to be negative 9. Now, again, you could do this with the x. You could do this part of it just all mental. That would be fine. But they multiply to be negative 36. So this has to be 1 and negative 36, or it's 2 and negative 18. That adds to be negative 16, not quite it. 3 and negative 12, that adds to be 9, a negative 9. So that's the two numbers we're looking for. They multiply to be negative 36, they add to be negative 9. If you start with 1, even if you know that's not the right answer, just start with 1 and work your way through the problem. Because I was trying to add to be a negative, I use my larger numbers as negative. All right, so we're going to bring down our 9x squared. We're going to split apart the negative 9x into our new factors, 3x minus 12x, and bring down our 4. So now we're going to circle our first group and circle our last group. You factor out what you can from the first group. A 3 comes into both of those numbers, and x can go into both of those. So you'd be left with 3 times 3, that makes 9. X times x, that makes x squared. 3 times 1, that makes 3. And x times 1, that makes x. Bring down that sign. That sign will always come down. So what can you factor out of this? You see that a 12 goes into both of those numbers. So negative 4 times 3x makes negative 12x. And negative 4 times a positive makes a negative. 4 times 1 makes 4. What's inside the parentheses has to be exactly the same. That's factor by grouping. You're actually factoring out the 3x plus 1. That's what you're factoring out. So your final answer is to bring down both of these. And there you have factored it. It doesn't matter which order you write those in. 2 times 3 and 3 times 2 is the same multiple, same quotient product. Next, we're going to try 12x squared plus 9x minus 3. Go ahead and try to factor that trinomial. So to factor this one apart, we could do our 12 times 3 to get negative 36. That would be one method. But the other method is to focus on the GCF, recognizing that we can pull out a 3 out of each of those terms. If we can pull a 3 out of each of those terms, we make the numbers much smaller. And this could be a good example of guess and check. So with guess and check, we just put numbers right into the parentheses. So we're looking for two numbers that are going to multiply to be 4x squared. A lot of people think that 2x and 2x are going to be a great set of numbers to multiply to be 4x. Seems reasonable to me. And then you need two final numbers that are going to multiply together to be 1. Well, that's only 1 and 1. But when you multiply this together, if this has to multiply to be -1, one of them has to be positive, one of them has to be negative. So you would get 2x minus 2x, and that gives you 0. So it's not going to be 2x and 2x. Let's try 4x and x. So here we get 4x squared. There we would get a 4x and a negative x and a -1. You can see this makes where we started from. We don't need to write that line, but that's what we are checking. Guess and check. We guessed it wrong the first time because our checking didn't work out. We guessed the second time and our checking worked. You don't need to write this checking, but just to let you know, this is what you have to check it, not just write down numbers. So there is your factoring, and we used the method guess and check. All right, maybe our last example we'll use for today. Will be that one. All right, for this one. Now remember, we don't want to use a third-party app to help calculate these out. You need to be able to calculate these kind of quickly and mentally more than looking for options online. So that one option you could do is multiply these two together. That would totally work. You'd get 144. And two numbers that multiply to be 144 that add to be -24 would be 12 and 12. That would completely work. Then you go ahead and solve it like we did before. Completely work. But what we're going to take a look at is, does this have a special pattern? Is this a perfect square trinomial? So we try to take the square root of x squared. You can probably do that mentally. Take the square root of 9. You can do that mentally. The middle part starts to get a little tricky, but it's 2 times those two values. 12 times 2 is 24. So 24x. That's what we've got. So yes, you can take the square root. Yes, you can take the square root. And the middle term is twice those products together. So our final answer is 4x, because it's a minus or a -24 minus 3 squared. It is a perfect square trinomial. It would be okay to write this as 4x minus 3 and 4x minus 3. That's the same thing also. But this is probably your best answer. There are other types of factoring we could talk about at another time.